Welcome to Paradigms at paradigms.life. Hi, I'm Baruch, host of the show. Thanks for tuning in. Really glad to be with you. We've got a wonderful guest on this episode who has taken his father's poetry and put it to music. We're going to be talking with him and listening to the songs and talking about how this record came to be and who his father was. A celebration of poetry. This episode is dedicated to the poet Patty Wixson. Patricia Wixson died this past week, surrounded by her family. Patty was a poet, a patroness of the arts, a mother, a grandmother, and so much more. I had hoped to share this episode with her, but that was not to be. So we're dedicating this episode of beautiful poetry set to music to Patty Wixson. All right, let's meet my guest now on this episode of Paradigms. Alex Martin, welcome to Paradigms.
So glad to be here.
I'm really glad to talk with you. You've just made this amazing record based on, working with your father, Michael Martin's poetry, the album Appalachian Fall, and these amazing poems you've set to music, just beautiful and very meaningful. And I want to talk with you about the project and some of the specific songs. But I'm really interested, before we do that, just to get a sense of who are you and what's your story and what's your dad's story, because he wrote these poems.
Well, so I was born in France, and more specifically in Brittany. That's where my mom is from, and they met over there. He's an American from the South. I did not grow up with him. I grew up with my mom in North Carolina mostly. She brought us to the States, my sister and me. So my dad and I were almost estranged for a lot of my childhood because he is a very single-minded person. He had a brain injury when he was a teenager, like it was in a very severe car accident, was almost killed. He became a very focused person, and for a few years that focus was on sports and on academics. He was, a star basketball player in high school, and then was, big man on campus at Davidson College, where his father was president in Davidson, North Carolina, north of Charlotte. And then he had one of these epiphanies that sometimes happens with poets. He just discovered that was really what he wanted to do, and he didn't really care about what people thought of, what he would call bourgeois society, I guess. And he just devoted himself entirely to that. That's all he did, was write poetry and create art. I mean, he worked some jobs in he was a gardener. He worked a pizza oven in a pizza shop. He did different things to get by, but it was also he could do his art. And he built a cabin on top of a mountain in Southwest Virginia in 1968, and he lived there for the next 30 years creating art. And then he moved to the family lake house on Lake Norman near Davidson, North Carolina, near Charlotte, but still was just doing his art. So over the course of my childhood, I felt like he had chosen his art over me, and I resented him for that. And he didn't make any money, so he couldn't contribute to our material well-being. And my mother was struggling, and as French immigrant, so he wasn't my best friend. But strange things happened. One is that I kind of let him have it in college and told him exactly what I thought. And his response, this is over letters, was, "I'm so glad you've told me this, and just let's keep up the conversation."
Wow.
And that was stunning. That was really what I needed to hear. And I just discovered that he was maybe the greatest listener that I've ever known. Other people that have known him, and I experienced a lot more of that in the past 6 months when we've had these memorial events for him. That's what everybody says. So he actually was a really extraordinary person, and he ended up becoming one of my best friends.
I'm so glad it came around to that.
It did, yeah. There were still issues. There were still things like in the last 2 years of his life, he was experiencing increasing dementia. He was having problems with his bladder. We'd have him over here, and those sorts of accidents happen. And I was cleaning up for him, and I was just really frustrated, thinking, how much did you do this for me when I was a kid? When did you change my diapers? And he just looked at me and said, "Why are you angry with me?" He really didn't understand And I wasn't really angry with him. I was just going through that. We end up spending a lot of time together in the past because he had to move up to be closer to us because he couldn't really live alone anymore. So I was doing a lot of caring for him. Who I am, I'm a musician, jazz guitarist. I, had made 3 CDs before this, and just playing around the DC area. Very interested in Brazilian music, Brazilian jazz, samba, bossa nova, forró. Then I was having an increasing difficulty maintaining my musical life because of all the time that I was spending working with my dad, caring for him. And I just decided I'm going to bring these 2 things together. I'm going to find a way to make my work with my dad part of my music. That ended up being a beautiful thing because for him, it gave him a sense that his work was continuing. He published in some regional magazines. He was Shenandoah, Iron Mountain Review, Pembroke Magazine, but he was never really interested enough in marketing himself. He was interested in creating, and he didn't really have time for that. But he had friends who were like a couple of friends who became North Carolina Poets Laureate, who supported his work, who said great things about him, wrote essays about his poetry. So, I felt like I had a responsibility to try to do what I can to get his work out there. The more that I went into it in the past couple of years, I realized what a document it is for me in particular. I mean, his work is multifaceted, but he wrote a lot about this place where he lived, this little community, this rural community in Southwest Virginia. And he became very integrated into that world. And he wrote a lot about the people, their stories, their ancestors' stories, the local lore. There were a couple of people in particular that he was very close to, a man who he calls Philo, who was just a sage of the mountains and who passed along a lot of these stories to him. And then also there was a woman who's a potter, ceramic artist. Her name is Georgia Blizzard. She's in that world. She's become fairly well known posthumously mostly, but her work is in the Smithsonian and other outsider or folk art museums. They would have these very intense conversations and he would record them. And some of these became the songs. I was drawn in particular to that, I think, because it showed me that my father was not this weird hermit that everybody said he was. He was actually very much part of this community. And maybe that's because in Appalachia, they have a soft spot for oddballs, because they see themselves a little bit as oddballs, or they're kind of denigrated a little bit as being hillbillies, uneducated or whatever, when in fact they have a lot of the people that my dad spent time with had very deep cosmologies and were very deep people.
I'm talking with Alex Martin about his new record, Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin. Alex has been talking to us about his father, Michael Martin, who he was, how he lived, and he's going to tell us more, and we're going to talk about the music. But first, let's hear one of these song poems. This is the first track on the album. It's called Into the Desert. Alex Martin from the album Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin. This is Paradigms at paradigms.life.
What passes for speech is mostly inertia, coasting downhill smoothly after having mounted on others' steam. But what moves and persists from the heart drives the rest of us also, and those others whose supply lines may be stretched too far. Because they labor in remotest fields, in the most improbable reaches of outlying life, where once they were transported from what they were cannot return. But maybe they'll slake their thirst for a moment when they need it most, and be restored, together with the powers which conveyed them there. Maybe once only, and far from here, or very near. But we must find the reservoirs, the collecting points, to pool those powers and preserve them. For when the long trains pass through on their way into the desert. Dream of being severed, cut loose and floating, down into the dark like a maple wing, spiraling out of the sun. But the core, the seed inside, wants out of its husk. It's like working on a stone bridge made of stalactites, condensing, drop by drop, out of dreams, out of the work done, out of the tears of those I've caused to suffer. There is no stopping place, no turning point, no return. I'm way out over it now and the fall is endless. But maybe the trains will pass over with all their transports through link on link, word on word, that bear the vibrations, the massive connections, the recollections, in chains. The long supply lines, trickling out of dreams into the desert, that will not stop for me.
That was Into the Desert from the album Appalachian Fall, The Song Poems of Michael Martin by Alex Martin. And now let's get back to my conversation with Alex and learn some more about his father, Michael Martin, and these poems. Let's talk about Appalachian Fall, the record and the songs. It's a really beautifully crafted collection. There are 10 songs, and as you've said in your write-up, everything is on the record is really in a specific order. You're telling a story. You're letting your dad tell his story, I guess, in some way, or tell stories about his life and where he is. I'm interested in, well, what the songs mean to you, and also just like the making of the record. You know, this, you have a wonderful vocalist, Jess Eliot Myhre, who is speaking and singing and vocalizing. And there's at least one track where I think I hear your dad's voice.
Yeah, I have to tell you about the vocalist. So Jess sings on 8 of the tracks. She's on 9 of the tracks. On 2 of them, the main vocalist is Will McKinley Ward, who's a wonderful Americana folk vocalist around here. And then on 1 of the tracks, maybe the one you're thinking it's my dad, there's one called A Lightfoot Death, which is about Philo Lightfoot is the name he gives to this man who is he calls his mountain father. And there are 4 songs that are sort of about Philo or are about the stories that Philo told Dad. And one of them is about the last months of Philo's, or last weeks of Philo's life. And so 2 of those songs really needed to be sung have a male vocalist, and that's why Will is singing there. But then there were a couple places where Philo speaks, and there was a man in my neighborhood here in Mount Rainier, Maryland, where I live, who is a folk musician and an artist, and grew up here, but his family is His father's family is from Harlan County, Kentucky, so he knows that world. And he was also, he and my dad really hit it off. So I asked Vernon Sears to be the voice Philo in that song. And yeah, I really like the job he did. Those are the vocalists. As far as the story of the album, the reason why the order is so important to me is the first three songs are about Dad alone or with his dog Hannah at the cabin, and it's kind of his interior world a little bit. There's a photograph that I have that was, I think Dad gave to me, of Philo. Probably Dad took this photograph. It's almost like Philo is standing in the clearing around the cabin, and he just emerges there. And then he appeared in Dad's life because he was always wandering the woods. He had grown up. My dad lived on top of a mountain. There was a gap. So the land drops off really sharply and goes into a gap with hollers in it. And that gap, called the Jimison Gap, which is Echoes in the Jimison Gap, is the title of one of the songs, was kind of a highway that people walked who lived in that community. If you walked the gap for like 4 miles, you'd end up in Saltville, Virginia, it was known as the salt mine of the Confederacy or the South. So there are these salt quarries. There are a lot of people who lived in these hollers, worked in the salt quarries. So in the early 20th century, that was their commute, and their houses were in the hollers, tucked away from the wind, and Philo grew up in one of those cabins, as did Georgia, who Dad calls Beulah in his poetry. Philo was able to share all these stories and this lore of these places. So once he appears, then there are 4 songs that are about, it's almost as if Dad's world opens out and starts to encompass these people of Plum Creek, of that community, and he starts to become part of that world. My dad wrote a lot about a lot of other things. He was a historian, so he was kind of casting all this against the backdrop of world history, especially the Holocaust, the Second World War. But I was particularly drawn to his poems about this community. So that's kind of the structure of the album. There's a song that's called Plain in the Ragged Twilights, which is about an important line in that song is it's talking about this man who was obnoxious, and he calls him a John Birch man, which in the 80s when my dad wrote that be today's MAGA, but he was the man who you could always count on to take care of your cattle if they needed, you to, feed your goats. He was the neighbor who was always there for you, even though he had a temper and was, irascible. And then the last song is called Appalachian Fall, the title track, which is just Dad up in the top of an apple tree, looking out over the community and naming all the different people that he sees in their farms and feeling himself part of this, just a celebration of community. So that's the sort of arc of the album for me. If you want to know any more about the musicians, they're my community here in Washington. I had a jazz drummer and jazz bass player, Keith Butler Jr. on drums and Steve Arnold on bass that I play with a lot in my jazz gigs. But then I found that there are also a lot of folk and Americana musicians around here that live right in some cases within a few blocks of me, who are really great. And I just pulled them into this project. The album is also my community here.
We'll be back with more of my conversation with Alex Martin. But first we're going to hear another track from the new album Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin, featuring one of the characters Michael Martin wrote about. This one's called Philo Meets the Machine.
A lot of peddlers roamed around back then. Mammy put 'em up for days at a time. Them and them hellfire and brimstone preachers, They set up a commissary over at the quarry. I had my first paying job over there, running the steam horse. I hung around the store during the lunch hour. Seemed like everybody in the world coming there, and they'd all be a-talking. I don't know how I got along before that. Yes, sir, that was my roundup of the daily news. Hunting, fishing, crops, jokes, gossip, tall tales. I sat on the steps and listened. But oh, the sharpest, sweetest smells come out that door. Soap, leather, licorice, cheese, ham, apples, varnish. I was just a boy and I didn't know much, but there was more things in that one place than ever I suspected, and all of it new. And I take it all in, with my slice of cheese, my nickel's worth of crackers, and a bottle of pop. They even had a machine back against the back wall that could take a measure. And I don't mean hide away. It wasn't your strength even exactly. You drop in your penny and squeeze, and it'd test you. It'd tell you how much juice you could take.
He drops in his imaginary penny. He lifts his arms and grips the handles. They're spaced wide apart for a boy, and trembling with the juice, the current, the shock of childhood with no insulation, on a raw mountain, with a demented father. In poverty, past imagining.
Yes, sir, that machine was like life. The harder you worked it, the more it'd get you. Well, I could stand right much more than most, I reckon, but I had to let go at last.
He smiles, and the great hands float between us, like falling leaves, like wide wings drifting down, flattening to rest on his knees, like a pair of ancient raptors gliding home to roost on familiar limbs across a hollow.
Philo Meets the Machine from Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin. And Alex Martin, Michael's son, is telling us all about this record. Let's get back to my conversation now with Alex Martin. You took it upon yourself. You wanted to get your dad's poetry out there. You made this record. But you have something you're communicating by doing this. It's not just what your dad's communicating. And I'm interested to know what it means to you to share this and what it is that you want people to be receiving.
This was an enormously rewarding project for me. I mean, I first have to put out a thank you to the Maryland State Arts Council, without whom I wouldn't have been able to do this. I got a grant from them. But it was, for me, it was a way for me to connect with my father, who a lot of the arc of my life has been reconciling myself with my father. And we had a full blossoming of that. And he was very excited about the project, up until the end. There was one point where he said to me, I just want you to know how excited I am about the work that I'm doing. I mean, that we're doing. I mean, that you're doing. So there's a transfer. So obviously that was very rewarding for me and allows me to connect more. In some ways, I've been more connected with my French and Breton side, but Appalachia and Brittany were once the same mountain chain, in the Pangea days. When I go over to visit my mom, I find the same granite, the same ferns, the same rhododendrons. The music is basically Celtic origin music. So for me, also, this album was a chance for me to step out even more as a composer. My previous 3 CDs all had, half of the tracks or more were my compositions, but in this one, they all were. It was my first attempt, really. I mean, my previous music, I've had singers on sometimes, and sometimes I've done songs with words, but they're jazz. In this case, it was not exactly jazz, and it really was about the lyrics. So this taught me something about, especially my dad's poetry is free verse mostly, and in some cases it was really more poetic prose. And I was trying to tame this or bring it into song forms. Anyway, as a composer, it was a very rewarding exercise, and I think this is probably some of my best compositional work.
It's interesting because some of the guitar playing is also free form in that it's not a traditional set of tonal progressions.
Very astute. Yes. Well, thank you for noticing that. In some cases, I was working with, trying to evoke the sort of D chord, G chord, A chord of a lot of that music, 1-4-5. But there are a number of songs where I was just with my guitar finding sounds that I liked that seemed to help tell the story. And so a lot of the songs, it was very hard for me to write down for the other musicians exactly, like in terms of chord symbols or something, what I was doing, because that's not the way I thought about it in terms of, they weren't those sorts of chords. I'm pretty influenced by this Brazilian composer, Ginga, Guinga. He's a composer and guitarist who writes that way. It's like he's just playing around with his instrument and finding sounds that he likes, and they may be within a tonal center, or they may be a little bit outside of a tonal center. So it was a very rewarding exercise for me as a composer as well.
It's wonderful. Listeners have heard me say this before. I'm a very bad guitar player, but I recently had an epiphany, which is I realized that it's not about learning to play the guitar. It's about making sounds with this instrument that I like. It's not about know the chords, know the fingerings. I don't know any of that stuff, but I suddenly have fallen into, I can make sounds that are pleasing, and that's music. And it's not about the knowing. I mean, no disparagement to all the learning people do and the studying. I mean, I have great admiration for that. But for those of us who aren't going to do that, it's just about making sounds.
Another person, a musician I really admire is Joni Mitchell, who I think that's, her approach. Or somebody like from part of North Carolina where I grew up, Elizabeth Cotton, who played the guitar upside down.
Yes.
You find Joni Mitchell, I think, found sounds that she liked, tuned her guitar differently, and it was not about, learning all the regular chords. It was about making music. And I think that's why musicians like Herbie Hancock and Wayne Shorter gravitated around to Joni Mitchell, why they found so much common ground.
I just read an old interview with her, and she talks about, and I can't remember the name of who it was, who turned her on to an open tuning, and that it opened a whole world for her of creating open tunings and different tunings. And just recently, my nephew loaned me his guitar, and it was tuned to an open G. Yeah. And I just was having so much fun with that because it's a whole different experience than the traditional tuning that we're used to. And anyway, so I mean, I love it that that's where you are with this and that you bring that into this project, because for the listener, it's there. You get it.
They're not open tunings because I feel like I'm still struggling to learn the guitar in standard tuning, and dadgad or these other tunings are like making it into another instrument. But still, that approach of like finding chords they might be up the neck or something, but they're still using open strings, and so I can keep I can go through some kind of strange sounds with what I'm doing, what I'm fingering, but have these open strings to keep a sort of continuity, so that grounds the listener, and the listener can kind of accept a little bit of atonality because there's something stable that's going on at the same time.
We'll be back with more of my conversation with Alex Martin about his new album, Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin, after we hear this song, Echoes in the Jameson Gap. You're listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.
Deeper into the mountain to cut wood above the price graves. I remember the sharp thud on the opposite ridge from the Leicester field where the Lightfoot cabin was, as if someone were there working beside me, driving an axe into a dead log, as if no one were there, no one else. I'd clap my hands and listen to the stillness and emptiness of the mountain, and to the echo which scored the stillness. For it was the sound of stillness, as the stillness was of absence. Absence of the hoot owl and the screech owl, woodpecker and wood thrush, wildcat and bobcat, panther and whippoorwill. And Philo said, memory of Lou Brown, no one knowed where she come from, or why she come there, of Rube Woods, a murderer of Ellen Walden, who built up fires and slept by the road with her 36 coat of 8 black brothers, poisoned and buried in a common grave, where a poplar blowed off of one brother who was sick and had an eaten, who went and hanged himself out by the Tin Ridge of Rowley. B-man from Naples, calligrapher, a grafter of fruit trees, of Private Riffy, who shot Stonewall, or so he believed. He hoed corn, reflected of Laurie Wellborn, the mayor's daughter, who hoed corn also, and took in washing of Laurie's daughter, Cleo Lightfoot, flower of the mountain, and of the Lightfoot holler. Of the hoot owl and the screech owl, woodpecker and wood thrush, wildcat and bobcat, panther and whippoorwill, and fire Milo said, in memory of Lou Brown, no one knowed where she come from or why she come there of rude words. Her murderer and Ellen Walden, who built up fires, who slept by the road with a 36 coat of 8 black brothers, poisoned and buried in a common grave, were a poplar blotter of 1 black brother who was sick and hadn't eaten, who went and hanged himself out by the tin bridge of Rowley. B-men from Naples, calligrapher, a grafter of fruit trees, of Private Riffy, who shot Stonewall, or so he believed. He hoed corn, reflected of Laurie Wellborn, the mayor's daughter, who hoed corn also and took in washing of Laurie's daughter, Cleo Lightfoot, flower of the mountain and of the Lightfoots, of the Lightfoot holler. I used to go deeper into the mountain to cut wood above the price graves.
We just heard Echoes in the Jameson Gap from Alex Martin's new album Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin. And now here's the next part of my conversation with Alex Martin. So this project for you stretched you. You grew musically.
I'm also involved in a group called Kundalika, which is I have Indian American friends here where I live, and one of them is teaching us, other people in this group, ragas and composing pieces, And so that has started to creep into my music, and so the song Sparklers, which is the conversation with my father with Beulah, the potter, Georgia Blizzard. I had to represent her on the album, and there's this really important conversation that's a text that I made into this song, and I was trying to figure out how am I going to do this, but I've just been learning this Chandra Kuntz raga from my friend Deep. You're not supposed to have chords in Indian music, but he allows me to create chords from the ragas and bring those into the pieces. And so that doing that and then the melody playing around with the raga, one section of that, like the refrain in that song, is based on that raga. And that's partly because it's a night raga that's intended to evoke night and that sort of instability. Dad and Beulah in this song are on her porch looking out at the stars and having this very cosmic conversation. So that started to feed in, that music has fed into that composition.
So the album's out there. People are listening. We're doing this interview. Hopefully lots of people will hear it. But in the life of a musical project, there's getting it out there as a recorded form. And are you playing this music live?
We had a really great CD release show at Blues Alley, which is the famous jazz club in DC. I mean, there are been others, but it's the one that's still standing.
I saw the Marsalises there once a million years ago. So yeah, great place.
When I was 12 years old, my aunt and uncle took me to see Milt Jackson there.
It's a tiny place.
Yeah. So that we did that. And I'm looking for other places. I would really love to find a place in Appalachia to play it, whether there's Appalachia here in Maryland, Appalachia down where my dad lives. It's the trick about this music is that it's not really music that you would play outside at a festival. It's kind of niche music, So I have to figure out how to find venues that would be interested in this sort of storytelling. It doesn't have huge, obvious popular appeal, but I know that the people who came to that show, it was a unique experience for them. All the feedback that I got afterwards was, wow, that was something. I never heard anything like that before.
Well, you said your dad was a great listener, and this album is for people who want to really listen deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. And on my previous albums, I've enjoyed having danceable music. I really like danceable music. That's one of my objectives in life, is to move people. But there's moving people physically, and here there's moving people spiritually. And to be true to my dad's music, I couldn't really do a lot of hoedown kind of stuff on this. There are a couple of tunes like that. The last tune is a little bit like that, Playing in the Ragged Twilights. One thing I learned in learning and promoting this record is that this album is considered mostly folk. Okay, that's not what I had started off thinking, oh, this is Americana, but Americana is actually more upbeat, a little bit more poppy. So, but there are a couple of songs, especially Playing the Ragged Twilights, which we're promoting that as an Americana single. The rest of the album we're promoting as folk, because that's their audiences, different audiences will gravitate towards it. But I wanted to promote the song Playing the Ragged Twilights in particular, because not just because it's more upbeat and might be easier for some people to listen to, but also because the message of it feels like something we really need to hear this year, when we're also anxious and divided politically. And this song is about how people in this small community, who, at least my dad, who is a liberal Democrat, and the people in this county that's overwhelmingly red, found themselves part of a kind of family. So my dad died in December, and in April we went down there to spread his ashes. And the people in that community, so many people still remembered him and were very moved by his death. And they said, just come and you can use our fellowship hall at the church. And then we think we can help get some of the older folks up the mountain. We have a bunch of ATVs. And this is what happened. We got together in the fellowship hall, and there were like 50 people there, all telling stories about how they had known him and how he had touched them, usually by his powers of listening. And then we got in the ATVs, and people in Dad's generation who are in their 80s and would have some trouble climbing up that mountain, got up there in these semi-luxurious ATVs, kind of like one of them looked kind of like a Humvee. But it got them up there. And so we were all up there at the top of the mountain to spread his ashes and say a few words about him. It was just a remarkable coming together at a time when it feels like we're being pulled apart. That's why I want that song to be out there.
We'll be back with the final part of my conversation with Alex Martin after we hear this song that he's talked about, Playing the Ragged Twilights.
Son, all elbows, rough, crude, profane. John Birch man, you can hear whisper 3 fields away. Jackie helped Robin Daisy make it through their last years, and other folks on the creek getting up at 5, stumbling round the hill to feed Rick's steers. Year after year, between 10-hour shifts in West Virginia, 80 miles over the mountain, done it for nothing, he said. Thus we keep rounding the days, planing the ragged twilights, fleecing and feeding, finishing the fences, currying the current droves, and driving them on, driven with them Thus we keep rounding the days, planning the ragged twilights, fleecing and feeding, finishing the fences, currying the current droves, and driving them on, driven with them and letting them go as we go with them, with the flow. As I climb a low mountain into the open, into the evening, high up on its pebbly spine, I hear the yapping of chain-guard dogs around 100 kitchens, quoting the property rights, and circling domestic circles, snarling with fortress fear, innocent of the fearful wonder of creation, white zone flung far and everywhere, planing the ragged twilight, planing the ragged twilight.
Planing the Ragged Twilights. That's Alex Martin with his father's poem set to music. And Alex has explained to us why this song is so important to him. With what's happening in the United States politically, we need to remember we're all in this together. Left, right, blue, red. We've got to focus on the common good. All right, here is the final part of my conversation with Alex Martin. It's a wonderful project, and I feel like in our conversation we just came full circle from the beginning of his life to the end of his life, and
Right.
and you are both chronicling it and part of it, and it's part of you. What a great project!
Very blessed to have this just sort of land in my lap, and that I knew what to do with it. That I got that grant that made it possible financially for me, and now that there's this record, and now people are humming his words to themselves, because music is the great mnemonic. Music and poetry are the great mnemonic devices. You know, were originally one, and bring them back together. I love the fact that I find myself singing these songs, and other people I know, tell me, "Oh, I can't get that one out of my head," And so his poetry is ingrained now in the heads of many of these listeners.
Music and poetry change the world every day, and so this is part of that. You're part of this great lineage of human artists.
And that's what you do also, it sounds like. I mean, what this show is partly about, right?
The goal is to bring inspiring people to listeners so that they will know that they can follow their inspirations. That's what makes humans do great things, is being inspired and giving ourselves permission to go with that. It's when we stop ourselves that we deaden, and we make human society less than what we can really be. I still believe that humanity has amazing potential, and we see great beauty and kindness every day. We just need those to be the things we celebrate more, instead of residing in fear and anger. And hopefully I have to believe we're on our way in that direction, but
Yeah.
There are steps forward and steps backwards. So
I heard an interview with the French Lebanese jazz trumpeter Ibrahim Malouf the other day, where he was talking about how, I mean, he has friends in Gaza he calls and tries to reach, and he's worried about them, and they say, "Don't worry, we're gonna, it sucks here, but we're gonna be okay." His message was, "You have to be optimistic. We don't have a choice."
great. Alex Martin, thank you so much for talking with me and for this project. And it's lovely to connect with you. I feel we're on the same page, and just thank you.
Bless you for creating this forum.
Alex Martin, thank you so much for being on Paradigms and talking with me about this record and about your father, Michael Martin, the poet. He clearly led a life of creativity and was very focused on that, and the journey that the two of you had in relationship, very meaningful. This record, Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin, bringing jazz and Americana musical styles together with this poetry, offering us a chance to really listen deeply and to reflect on our own lives and our own connections with community and with the land. Wonderful music, wonderful poems. Folks, if you'd like to know more about Alex Martin, about this record, go to alexmartinmusic.com. Very simple. Check out this whole album and Alex's earlier works. And if you'd like to know more about Michael Martin, go to his website, mikemartinpoetry.com. Thank you so much, Alex, for bringing this to us. And if you enjoyed this episode of Paradigms, I hope you'll visit the Paradigms website at paradigms.life, where you'll find all of our episodes archived, going back to 2009. And at the bottom of that page, you'll find a link to my latest project, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, an audiobook, narrated by Starhawk. All right, well, we're going to close out this episode with one more track from Appalachian Fall, the song poems of Michael Martin. It's the final track on the album, Appalachian Fall. We thank Alex Martin and Michael Martin for this music and these poems, and we appreciate Patty Wixon, the poet to whom this episode is dedicated. And let's let the word for the week be listen. Let's really listen. Let's listen deeply, listening to ourselves, listening to others, listening to the land. Let's listen deeply. All right. Baruch signing off for this episode of Paradigms. We'll be back next time with more inspiring people. Until then, listen and be well.
Way up in the Henniger's tree just now, picking the last apples, and the wind over the hill coming on. Swaying I reached, and it blew them past me. Swaying again reached, and it blew them down. Again reached, and it blew us together, me and the branch and the breeze, whispering together, bending, almost breaking. And on the new ridge crest, on the slate gray sky, I saw flow steers feeding on Beulah's new roof, and Philo and Clyde hammering at their feet, and thought bowed to the hammers for their bread as they to the grass, hammering on, ruminating on, the wind blowing on and on. I to the apples, apples to the branch, branch to the roots, to the fields, to the beef and the workmen. Where my brother's is the altar, and whose is the sacrifice, and for whom bow the apples, blows the wind. As I reached for the apples, was I reaching for the wind? apples to the branch, branch to the roots, to the fields, to the beef and the workmen. Where, my brothers, is the altar, and whose is the sacrifice? And for whom bow the apples, blows the wind? As I reached for the apples, was I reaching for the wind? At the top of the tree, the branches swayed, and I too swayed and sang. Oh, where is the altar? Oh, and whose is the sacrifice? Yes, oh, where is the altar? And whose is the sacrifice?
You've been listening to Paradigms at paradigms.life.